Welcome back to Visited by Voices Live. I am joined today by one of the most seminal figures in horror fiction in my life. And I say that for a very basic reason. As a kid coming from, I'm going to say, a meager background, a lot of the books that I was able to get in those early years were either used or from the library or both. And one of those very early books, which I talked to you guys a lot about in the past, and one of the series actually, was Charles Grant's Shadows series. This book, Shadows 3 from 1980, is absolutely one of the first books that I owned and read and reread as a burgeoning horror fan. And like most people just getting into reading fiction at a young age, I was probably 10 or 11. You start with the shortest story in the book. In this case, The Bureau by Steve Rasnic Tem was the first book of one of the very first horror books that I read. And it set a tone for me that made me read the rest of the book. This wasn't what I was seeing on television called horror. This was something deeper, more personal, more psychological, but at the same time, unnerving in a way that I was not expecting to even be possible. It started a love affair with horror that continues to this day. Now, Steve Rasnic Tem is author of many novels and even more, many more short stories. Just clarified with him before the show began, and to date, 468 short stories have appeared. He's worked in multiple genres, fantasy, horror. Is it fair to say mystery as well?
Yeah, about I think it was like 36 mystery stories.
So along the way, he's won pretty much every genre award you can imagine. 4 Stokers, the World Fantasy Award, the British Fantasy Award, 2 International Horror Guild Awards. And they're all well-deserved because at a time when names like Stephen King, Peter Straub, James Herbert, John Ferris, Guy N. Smith, John Blackburn, Whitley Strieber were making a huge impact on the scene, Steve Rasnic Tem was actually providing the foundation to go a lot longer and further, I feel, in the long term, especially, again, in the short form. I don't think we could have had the Del Abyss line or the Borderlands anthology without that groundwork that Tem dug out for us decades ago at this point. So please welcome to the show, Steve Rasnic Tem. How are you, Steve?
Oh, good. Thank you.
And I just turned on my view of the chat, and there's a ton already there. So that warning that you and I had in the conversation before the show began about keeping up with it may be an issue tonight. So guys, if you don't get through, I promise you it's not because I'm not trying.
Good.
So, where do we even start with your career? I mean, I started with you with the Shadows anthologies because, it's as Charles L. Grant was responsible for so many people getting a higher platform. But where do you place the beginning of your career?
Well, Shadows was near the beginning. That was at the Bureau, I think, was something like my 3rd published story. My first published, the first piece of fiction I was paid for was a story called City Fishing, which Ramsey Campbell published in a British anthology called New Terrors. And that was republished over here in a smaller volume. I had just found his address in a Locus magazine. And I had not thought of myself as a horror writer before then, but I liked dark materials. I liked what I refer to as human mysteries, and especially psychological mysteries. And had this idea for a story that was based in part on a dream I had had. And I liked the dreamlike cadence of it. And at that point, I'd written a lot of poetry, probably had published about 100 poems. I was a graduate student in creative writing at Colorado State, getting my master's in creative writing. And a lot of the stuff in my thesis was basically, I thought of it as science fiction or fantasy, although my advisors thought of it as surrealism. In fact, they got me into the program because they believed I was some sort of Southern surrealist because of the things I wrote. A lot of those things later were published in science fiction magazines. But anyway, I had this idea for a story. I saw that Ramsey Campbell was looking for horror stories. So I'm thinking, well, this is, I guess, a kind of horror story. So I finished it, sent it to him, and he bought it. And that made me rethink a lot of the things I had been trying to do with fiction. I'd been trying to write these psychological stories, and in part because of my academic background. I wanted to be another Richard Brodigan or a Donald Barthelme or or maybe even a John Gardner, one of the new wave fabulous that were popular during the 60s. And those were the kinds of writing that was the kind of writing I aspired to. And so, but I began to see that there were a lot of genre connections to the kind of writing I was doing. And so once I published that story, I looked at a lot of the other stories I was working on, and I finished those, and I started sending them to Stuart Schiff for Whispers. I found I knew that Charlie Grant had an anthology series called Shadows, and I found his address. I can't remember where I found his address. It wasn't a call for submissions, but I just sent him at the Bureau at that point. He'd already closed Shadows 3, but he read it quickly, and then he added it to the table of contents. And so at that point, of course, I was encouraged, so I started sending my brand of horror stories to all the markets I could find. I would get magazines, and back in those days, you would get magazines and you would find the editorial address and you would just send stories that way. There really wasn't a lot of information floating around about markets and that kind of thing. You just went to magazines and got the addresses, or in Locus, sometimes you would find addresses of editors. And sometimes I would send them stories not even knowing if they had an open call for submissions or not. But basically, that's how it started to build. At that point, I had read in college a lot of Lovecraft, and I had read a lot of British ghost stories. Although at the time, I didn't really think of them as ghost stories as much as kind of spiritual stories. But I didn't really think about writing them until I had written things like City Fishing. And over the next few summers, I just read everything I could, trying to fill in the gaps of my knowledge of the genre. And it's something I still do, is I try to read as much as possible. And I kind of expand my idea of what I want to do that way.
So I don't know if you've read Charlie Grant's little paragraph bio that predates Shadows 3, your appearance in Shadows 3 recently, but a lot of it has to do with a specific story. But the opening line is, Steve Rasnic Tem is a poet, short story writer, and newlywed. And I find that to be the other side of the story. Obviously, it was one thing to always be able to pick up almost any anthology on the market and see the name Steve Rasnic Tem appear in, it felt like, just about everything for a decade and a half. But there was a good chance that Melanie Tem's byline would be in an anthology almost as often. Can you talk a little bit about that partnership?
Yeah, I met Melanie in a writer's workshop. At that time, when Ed Bryant was alive, for decades, he ran the Denver area science fiction writers workshop. And I joined it when I had finished my graduate degree at CSU. I had this degree and I really didn't know what to do with it. I wanted to write science fiction, but I didn't really know how, or I didn't really think I knew enough or had enough perspective. So I had heard that Ed Bryant had this workshop. So I sent him a letter and asked him if I could join, and he said, sure. So I went for about 6 or 7 months. And then one day, Melanie joined the workshop. And she had been writing short stories for a long time. She hadn't yet published anything, but she had gone to things like the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and she had had several mentors who were literary writers, and she wanted to be a literary short story writer, basically. She asked me, we got to be friends, and she asked me if I would read her novel manuscript, which I did, and I was blown away by it. It was a mainstream kind of feminist novel about a young woman um, coming to terms with the 60s and protesting and demonstrations and such. And we very soon after that started dating, and about a year after we started dating, we got married. And she read everything I wrote before it went out, and I always took her criticism seriously. In fact, she's one of the best critics I ever knew because, at least line by line, she knew language. She knew what made a good sentence. She knew what made a good paragraph. And I always found her criticism to be spot on. And during that time of reading my stuff, she became interested in writing dark fiction, even though she had read almost none of it. Her entire background was literary fiction. So I recommended things for her to read. And in time, reading my stuff and reading various women writers and reading Charlie Grant's anthologies, she started writing stories of her own in that genre. And that's basically how it started. At a certain point, I was getting lots of invitations in those days to contribute to anthologies. And I didn't have time to write for all of them. And once or twice, I would come up with a story idea and I write the first few pages, and then I really wasn't sure what to do with it. So I would hand it to her and see what she thought. And then she would write me something back. And that's how the collaboration started. Later on, they became a lot more deliberate, but in the beginning, it was just my being stuck and handing her something to develop for me. And we would go back and forth and write the stories that way.
So Daniel out in the chat has a question that's related to this. He actually got it in right as I was speaking that question to you. But the latter half of it says, did you ever clash over a particular story?
No, and that's surprising. But we had very similar aesthetics. We had very similar ideas about what was good writing and what was not so great writing. And I trusted her writing and I admired her writing. And she was also my biggest fan. And so what we tried to do was not to take individual ownership on the stories. When we did the collaborations, what we were trying to do was to create a third voice, a third kind of story that was different from anything we would write by ourselves. And so by doing it that way, we never really felt like one of us was being slighted because we were creating this third author's work. And so it didn't feel personal when one of us didn't like something or one of us wanted to change something.
So with those collaborations, were you doing a lot of planning, or was that much more just shooting from the hip?
It was more shooting on the hip it was more a reaction to invitations to write stories. Now, occasionally some sort of anthology would come about that sounded like it'd be a great thing for both of us to do at the same time. And sometimes instead of collaborating, we would each submit a story. And sometimes she would get something accepted and I wouldn't. and sometimes I would get something accepted and she wouldn't. So it came about that way. Something like The Man on the Ceiling was a bit more planned. Someone was working on an anthology proposal of stories in which the authors wrote about themselves, in which they were a character in a story. And although I tend not to like that self-conscious writing, I thought there was a real opportunity there. Melanie was much more skeptical. She thought, who would want to read something like this? And basically, my argument was, well, no one's going to read this, so we don't have to worry about that. This person's never going to sell this anthology, but I think it'd be a great exercise to do, and I think we would learn a lot. So we wrote the story, and part of the reason it's so naked, in a sense, is because Melly didn't think it was ever going to be published, partly because I told her it would never be published. So.
And it's definitely a corner of the market that you had kind of cornered. You were both kind of writing what would be called quiet horror, although I think that terminology, though popular, sometimes is misleading. And that's something you've maintained through your career up until Ubo, which is definitely not quiet. But for a long time, you knew when you were picked up a Tem story, and I'll just say a Tem story, that you were getting something that was going to have the fear was going to come from the resonance of the ideas and the emotions, not from anything being thrust in your face as a reader.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a conscious decision? Because it seems like the market was moving in the opposite direction. So you found success moving against the grain, it would seem.
Well, I've always liked a lot of different kinds of horror stories, at least as a reader. I've read a lot of really graphic horror fiction, and I've enjoyed a lot of it. I tend to prefer being subtle. I tend to like the challenge of having something coming out of basically nothing, just a few small elements, and somehow finding a story and all that. I've always enjoyed the challenge of that. I'm also a great fan of the early British ghost story tradition with writers like M.R. James and Burridge and Benson and those folks. I admire that fiction quite a bit. And so I wanted to write my own kind of version of that. And just to me, it was just more challenging. The other thing about graphic horror is there's so many ways for it to go wrong. If you can find the right image, the perfect image, there are a few things more powerful. But so often you have an image that isn't quite that resonating, that all it really has to say for it is that it's graphic and specific. And so I tended to steer away from those because I felt there were so many ways to go wrong. But at the same time, I have written some graphic stories. I wrote stories for the Book of the Dead anthologies and a few others, but it is kind of a minority of my work. Ubo was meant to be kind of all out, as graphic as I'll ever want to go. And I've been planning that book for a long time.
Yeah, it sort of is Franz Kafka meets Lucio Fulci, definitely.
Yeah.
So you've won a ton of awards. Is that important to you, or was the readership more important?
I can't remember who the writer was, but someone once said that awards are like happy accidents, and they shouldn't be taken any more seriously than that. I mean, they're nice things. It's nice to be recognized every once in a while, and that kind of gives you a little boost and keeps you going, because writing is a fairly lonely, isolated profession, and you often don't get much feedback, especially short story writers don't get very little feedback in general, because when you see a review, maybe they give one line or two to your story, and a lot of readers just don't respond that much to short stories. so it's nice getting the awards for that reason, but I don't think it's anything that should be a goal or anything that you really should strive for, because I think it can distort your process and confuse you about what's important.
A good friend of the show, Jess Graham, asks that he was curious about some of your experiences writing plays.
Well, I really got into plays because Melanie also wanted to be a playwright. She became, especially the last 20 years of her life, 15 years of her life, she became enormously interested in playwriting and joined the playwriting group Colorado Dramatists here in Colorado, and she wrote several full-length plays and several one-acts, and several of those plays were produced here in Colorado, but also in Pennsylvania. One was produced in Chicago, and she was in love with the form. In fact, I've put all those plays and her poetry together, and sometime in the next year or so, Crossroads Press will be issuing a collection of all those plays along with her poetry.
That's incredible.
But she was so into plays, it got me interested. And so I wrote a couple of one acts, one of which was produced in a little town, a small theater a few miles from here. Actually, that was a sort of a mystery crime play. But that's really the only one I've ever had that was produced. And the thing about plays is, well, I have a close friend who's a playwright, or used to be a playwright, and basically, as he explained it to me, it was a career where he made very little money. In fact, it was less money than a poet would make, really, and all that was used up flying around the country to see his plays produced. And he was always losing money flying around to see these plays produced. He loved it, but it's such a hit and miss thing. I mean, you can win major playwriting awards and never have your play actually produced. So it's a wonderful form, but in terms of economics, it's a strange form. So it was a little hard for me to get into it, in part because of that. Even though I find plays exciting and I love going to the theater, or at least I used to before we had the plague.
And Dan also comes back and says he wanted to ask you about your amazing novel, Deadfall Hotel. As I understand it, it took many years to write and was based on a short in Shadows 9. Can you tell us about that novel's journey?
Yeah, I wrote this long piece for Shadows 9. And it took place in this hotel, the Deadfall. And even as I was writing it, I was thinking it would make a great section of a novel. That I could do a lot with this whole idea of the hotel. And I like the idea of the hotel as a metaphor for horror fiction and all different things that can be done in horror fiction. And I was thinking I could write since you have guests coming to the hotel, you could have various chapters having to do with the various guests, and they would be different figures from horror fiction. And Charlie Grant urged me to finish it, and Al Sarantonio also was a big fan. He encouraged me to finish it. But there's a thing about me in novels is that they seem to take me forever. I am almost never satisfied, and I find that I have to let them steep and grow in my imagination, and I'll write some of it and then I'll maybe drop it for 6 months because I'll have an idea for short stories I want to write. I think part of it is impatience. When you write a short story, you get this wonderful sense of completion every week or 2, 3 weeks, however long as you take to write the story. You get this sense of completion, and you have to put that off with the novel forever. I mean, some people are able to see finishing a chapter, that they get a sense of completion from that. I never was able to do that.
Never.
So that's why Deadfall Hotel took 2 or 3 decades. Um, Bloodkin took. I wrote the first chapter of Bloodkin when I was in high school. So that was maybe
Really?
that was like a 40, 50-year journey. Yubo, I started thinking about that book when I was a freshman in college, and wrote pieces of that over many years, knowing all the time that I wasn't yet good enough to finish it. So I kept putting it off till I thought I had the skill to finish it. And then I finally finished it because I figured if I didn't finish it soon, I would die before it was done. So uh, it's a long, long process.
You mentioned Bloodkin, and I think we need to highlight that just for a moment here. 2015, Bloodkin comes out. It's kind of a big Southern Gothic horror piece, and it really, inside the horror beltway, as it were, it really got steam behind it to the point where it was the Stoker winner for that year. And a lot of people, I remember talking at the time on places like the Shock Lines board, were finally feeling like you were getting the recognition that had been overdue for a long, long time. Did it feel like that to you, or did it just feel like you finally got this novel that took you all your life to write out?
Well, Bloodkid is an odd one because I'd always wanted to write this Southern Gothic novel, and when I was in high school, I thought that was what I was destined to write, was this Southern Gothic novel. Later on, as I became more interested in horror, I knew it would be a blend of Southern Gothic and horror. And I was very excited to write it. I had lots of notes for it. And I spent a lot of time on it, finished it, was very pleased with it. And I sold it as my second novel to Solaris. But one of the things that happened was that Melly passed away before it was published. And so when I was nominated for the award, it was only, I think Melly had only been gone for like a month. So I remember watching the Stokers streaming online, sitting in my office with a beer. And if you know me, that's unusual. I think it's the only beer I've had in like 40 years. And I thought I should have a beer for this. And when I won, I felt absolutely nothing.
Really?
Absolutely nothing. It's because without Melly to share it with, it really didn't mean much. I mean, I was glad I got it. I think the next day I enjoyed it for maybe 4 or 5 hours, but I never really was able to feel much about that. I wanted people to read it, and I'm glad it won the award, and that helped some. But that novel has sold fewer copies than any other of my novels. Deadfall Hotel did relatively well, but and U-Boat did a lot better than Bloodkin. But mostly, although a lot of horror fans did read the book, and it got a lot of critical acclaim, a lot of other people, the comments I would get were, "I don't want to read a novel about rednecks."
Well, wow.
And there was a strong anti-Southern feeling from a lot of people who picked up that book and said they didn't want to finish it because it was about Southern people. It was about people from Appalachia. And of course, that's where I grew up. That novel basically takes place in the 30s of my small community in Southwest Virginia, Lee County. And a lot of those details are right from the history of Lee County. And so I did take it a little bit personally that people didn't want to read about that. And it's interesting that it was published by a British publisher, Solaris. And in fact, when I pitched ideas to my editor at Solaris, that was the one he was most interested in reading. So it's strange.
Well, the Southern Gothic tradition in America kind of is the counterpart to, say, the M.R. James type of British ghost story. There's
Yeah,
definitely a connection there, a literary connection. So I could see why the appeal was. And certainly inside the Beltway, there was real attention to the novel. It's just in the mainstream, you probably faced what you faced. I find it ridiculous that people would not read a novel because it's about people from one area. I keep saying we're still way too tribal of people in too many directions. We got to change that.
yeah. I think it's a book that has never quite found its audience. I think there's a big audience for it, but I don't think it's ever been able to find that. So, in fact, if you order Blakein, I believe if you order Blakein from Amazon now, you have to wait a few weeks because it's being printed in England. So, or I think it's available through Amazon International. So there's always a delay getting it. So it's strange. I don't understand it, but
Well, we're going to get to the changes in publishing in just a second, but because how can you not talk about it? It's the elephant in the room anytime you talk about books. But I want to take a detour first, just a couple years back to the mask shop of Dr. Black.
yeah.
So this is you entering the young adult market. So a lot of writers have, and there's definitely a real customer base there. Is it something you did intentionally, or did the story just end up getting marketed that way? Because I hear that a lot from people, that they never meant it necessarily to be a young adult, but that's how it ended up being marketed.
It was always intended to be a middle grade novel. I've always read a lot of YA middle grade literature, in part because I had kids and nieces and people that I was giving books to, and so I wanted to read the books before I gave them to them. And so I spent a lot of time researching and looking for the best grade level appropriate books for my kids and my relatives from the time they were seventh, eighth, ninth grade on up through high school. And so I read a lot of young adult literature, and I loved a lot of young adult literature. And so it was always my intention for that book to be a middle grade novel. It was another book that took me a long time to write, much longer than it should have, but I actually wrote the first few chapters of that on a VIC-20 computer.
Really?
Yeah.
A Commodore VIC-20?
Yeah, with the tape drive.
Oh,
and so
was that at the time what you were writing on, or did you find some vintage thing to write on to see the experience?
Well, I got involved with personal computers really early, and I kind of like to collect them and gather them. So, I bought a VIC-20, and then later I bought a Commodore 128, and I had various early IBMs. I had various Radio Shack computers, and I just liked fooling around with them. And what I liked about the VIC-20 is hooked up to a TV, it had that kind of childlike appeal to it. So I was thinking, well, this would be a great computer to write a child's novel on it, or a middle grade novel. So I started it that way, and then I would I remember I wanted to transfer it over to an IBM, and so I had to actually learn how to make a cable to go between the two, so that I could print out from the VIC-20, and it would send it over the serial cable into my IBM and actually transfer it directly. So I spent a lot of time and money just fiddling with cables and learning how to make my own cables, and that particular novel was probably written on 6 or 7 different computers. And so finally, I did get it finished, and I tried to sell it, and I actually couldn't find a publisher for it. In some ways, because it was a little bit old-fashioned, but also some editors didn't like the main character. I was also told that Halloween YA fiction is very seasonal, and that makes it a hard sell because there's only a limited time that they think they can sell it, and often what you find is being sold at time of year are older Halloween-based novels. So it's harder to sell a newer one. But I was talking to an editor at a Rocky Mountain Book Fair one day who involved with Hex Publishers. I told him about the book, and he really wanted to see it. I sent it to them, and they bought it. And they did a nice job with it. So that's how that book came to be. I don't know if I'll write another YA novel or not. I have one that's about 2/3 finished, which I haven't finished yet, and have no publisher lined up for anything, but maybe I will finish it and maybe it'll be published. We'll just have to see.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I have a Commodore 64 in the closet, and there's a 5.5-inch floppy disk that has a novel on it, and it'll never see the light of day because I was probably 13, and it would require more work than just writing something new.
Well, I'm sure you got something out of writing it.
Yeah, I probably at least stopped me from doing all the stuff I was doing at 13 that would have gotten me in trouble. So I wanted to also detail just briefly the hydrocephalic ward from 2003. Your poetry collection?
Yeah.
So poetry is kind of one of those infamous things. More recently in the horror genre, because the Horror Writers of America Association has put more of a spotlight on it, it's a little more high profile than it was. But for a long time, horror poetry was even harder than regular poetry to sell and make a go of. But it's always been an interest of yours, I take it.
Yeah, well, my major concentration when I went to CSU in the creative writing program was poetry. That's what I spent the most time on. That was the main reason that they let me into the program, was my poetry. And it was the main reason I wanted to go to a creative writing program, a university creative writing program, because fiction, you can read a lot of fiction, and there's a lot of obvious theory out there in books that you can read. With poetry, it's a little bit harder to figure out what you should be reading, what technical books you should be reading, what theory you need to absorb. So I felt I needed more guidance there, and that was the main reason I wanted to go to a writing program. So I wrote a lot of poetry for a lot of years, and in fact, that's one of the things that reasons that my early short stories were so short, was because I was used to writing poetry, and then I was writing prose poetry, and so it was very hard for me to write anything over 1,500 words, because that was my idea of a narrative, that narratives needed to be small and compact and short. And actually, I think it did help me as a writer in terms of making me write more concisely. So I was really obsessed with poetry for a long time. I edited this anthology, the Umbrella Anthology of Science Fiction Poetry, which was a finalist for the Philip K. Dick Award when it was published. And I was very, very involved in poetry for a long time. But then as I became more and more interested in fiction, and was spending more time working on fiction, I found that poetic energy basically went into the fiction, and because of my style of writing. So I still write 1 or 2 poems a year, but it's just something that I don't feel driven to write anymore.
So being probably one of, if not the most proficient or prolific short story writers in the horror genre, at least modernly, it's interesting because I think you also have published a decent amount of novellas. These are all forms that on the surface seem to be a perfect match to horror. Novels seem to be almost the worst match to horror as a form. And yet, as far as popularity goes, you can sell a novel to a publisher a lot easier than anything else at this point, because there's an assumption that novels are what people want. Yeah. Any thoughts?
Well, it's basically true. I mean, short story collections are hard to sell, and in fact, oftentimes you're better off having a short story collection published by a small press, because if it's published by a major publisher, if it doesn't sell well, and it won't sell as well as your novels, it kind of brings your numbers down. So it's usually not a good strategy to publish a short story collection with a major publisher. In fact, it has hurt the career of a number of writers by doing that. Uh, yeah, I would agree that the short story or the novella form is perfect for horror fiction. And in fact, for a long time, I felt that most of those novels being published in the 80s and the 90s would have been much better if they were novella length. A lot of padding goes into those books. And in part, it's because I think the publishers and the editors at the time were encouraging you to write these horror stories, which, just in terms of their pacing and their development, really were better suited to a shorter length. I think the way to write a horror novel and have it be a full-fledged, authentic, genuine novel is to have the horror just to be part of the book. I think that it needs to be just one aspect of the book. I think you need to change the scope and think of other things other than the horror plot to make it work. This is generally my feeling.
I agree. I almost feel like the horror should be the B plot, because that's where it works best. And then it gets to become the A plot at the very end. Yeah, I agree. I just find it fascinating because you're one of the forefront figures in the shorter end of the horror spectrum, and you've created a great career for yourself. But it would have been nice if there's more of an embracing in the mainstream of shorter formats, because I think that really you could have had an easier ride of it than you did.
Yeah, and I think even something like Deadfall Hotel, it's a horror novel, but it's basically a collection of stories that has been with the same characters, and it's kind of an episodic kind of novel, and that's why I was able to get away with making that into a novel, I think.
Yeah. Now I want to take you back before the beginning.
Okay.
This is all my master plan.
When I'm an embryo?
No, not quite. 1978, Decoded Mirrors.
Yeah.
Basically, what we call now a chapbook. Three stories. Lovecraftian, or actually pretty much outright Lovecraft homages, but with a twist.
Yeah.
Which is that you sort of personified Lovecraft's creations in very human terms, which is actually kind of the opposite of Lovecraft in many ways, because he was never concerned with the human side of the stories.
Yeah.
Was Lovecraft a big influence in the beginning?
Not really. When I read Lovecraft, it was in college. And it was around the time that Ballantine put out all those Lovecraft collections with the heads.
Yep.
And
Shuttered Room with the half head.
Yeah, there was like 5 or 6 of them. And I read them all. And I found them interesting in terms of just his cosmic vision was unlike anything I'd ever read before. But I didn't care for the actual writing, didn't care for the actual style. It's not something that I aspired to. But that relationship of the characters with this unfeeling cosmos, this really dim view of humanity and their place in the universe stayed with me. And so that as a subject matter interests me. And even Lovecraft himself as a subject interests me because of all these undertones of his difficulties with race and people from different cultures, this kind of xenophobia he seemed to have. Now, whether it was Now, whether he was more xenophobic than the average person at the time, I don't know. A lot of people say he was, but I don't know if I have the proper education to know if that was out of the ordinary or not. I just don't know. So, but I do like the stories to a certain degree.
I always feel it's unfair for us to even to focus as much as we do on that stuff, not because of the time period argument. I think there was good people who had the right mind, or not the right mindset, but a healthy mindset in any time period. So that's no excuse for pernicious ideas. But I have an issue with the fact that I think there's a human tragedy with Lovecraft. I mean, this is a guy who lost his father before he knew his father, who lost his mother, who was raised by aunts who were, by all accounts, horrible human beings, who did some pretty awful things to a young man. He was basically a shut-in for most of his life. He did some traveling, but even that he did in solitary. Couldn't keep a marriage going. Was miserable among people. I think there's some real deep psychological issues that come into the territory that's, I find, sad. Before, I don't get angry at the man for his racism. I get sad because that's the life he had, and that's how he dealt with it.
Yeah, I guess for me, Lovecraft, he's like any other subject matter. You write a story about ghosts, you write a story about vampires, you write a story about Lovecraftian figures. He's an influence only to that extent. So for me, he's this person who's long dead. He's just something else to write about. I wrote those particular stories in part because I just loved those little chapbooks the Necronomicon Press put out, and I wanted to have one of them. And I always, because I had not done much with Lovecraft at the time, and because he was such a strong figure, I began to wonder, well, what would I do with some Lovecraftian subject matter? How would I handle this material? And so those three stories came out of that impulse.
Do you think it's odd that we focus as much on Lovecraft today as we do, and say someone like an Algernon Blackwood is mentioned only by the most hardcore horror readers?
I don't know if it's odd. It's just that this idea of stories that are connected by a common cosmos, and stories that would seem to a lot of body of fiction, which seems to have a wide cosmic vision, seems to appeal to people. It's never particularly appealed to me as at least as my main go-to reading. I mean, to me it's kind of a side reading. It's for me, M.R. James is much more important as a writer to what I'm looking at than Lovecraft. And as far as that goes, Italo Calvino is a much more important writer to me and what I'm trying to do than Lovecraft ever was. So it's just not my particular bag. It's not something that I'm that interested in. I guess I am a little surprised that he's still as influential as he is in some ways, because I think there are a lot more interesting writers out there. But if you like it, that's fine.
All right, we have two last questions for the chat before we wrap things up tonight. So I'm going to ask you: do you want the serious question, or do you want the silly as hell question?
Do I have to choose?
No, well, you'll get them both, but it's really the order. Which one do you want first?
Let's do the serious question first, then.
Okay. So from our friend Daniel again, can you tell us about To Denver, your stories in Zombies versus Robots?
Oh, well, that was basically an editor who had this project for IDW. I guess it's IDW. There's the Zombie versus Robot series of comic books that they did for a long time, and they were going to do some prose anthologies. and it was a way to make some money, and it sounded fun. Um, I generally don't like doing stories like that because I don't own the rights to it. And so I like to have the rights to everything I do. So it's very, very rare that I will do work in someone else's property, but there was a fair amount of money involved, and I thought it might be fun. And I wrote it during this period when marijuana had become legal in Colorado, and at that point, I lived in an old section of Denver, and I could walk out my door, and there would be 14 or 15 dispensaries within 2 blocks of my house, along with marijuana cafes, uh, and all kinds of businesses. This was before they had them regulated as they are now. But they were just basically, when marijuana first came into Denver, pretty much every empty storefront, every empty building along any business area was taken up by these dispensaries. So, of course, it was an enormous boon to Colorado real estate. And so, naturally, I wanted to put that whole thing about marijuana and dispensaries into the story. And I like writing about robots. So I just had a lot of fun with it.
Are you ready for the silly question?
Sure.
So this comes from our good friend, Oric145626, who goes way back in the community. Yeah, there you go. Goes way back in the community, and he has some singular obsessions to feed. He asks, favorite soda and pizza topping?
Oh, favorite soda and pizza topping. Well, right now, it's Pepsi Zero. Also, I drink Coke Zero. I try to not drink too many of them because they're bad for you. I used to like Diet Mountain Dew as my favorite go-to drink. Then I discovered it's basically the worst possible thing you can drink of all the sodas. I believe it. Well, I don't want to get you sued, but I think I heard something about it turns into formaldehyde in your body or something. It does, some terrible things happen with it. So for a long time, I drank a whole lot of it for many years, though. So I guess now maybe Coke Zero would be my favorite. As far as the pizza topping, well, I love pizza. I would eat pizza every day if I didn't know they would kill me. I guess pepperoni would be my favorite topping.
So this is a subject that's come up on the show before. So in South Jersey, not where I live, but in South Jersey, it's very common to find pizza places that shred the pepperoni, not in slices. It's shredded like a sausage, a shredded sausage. Have you ever had? And are you fundamentally opposed to?
Well, it's funny because the really cheap frozen pizzas shredded.
Yeah,
it turned to little tiny squares. So that makes me skeptical right away of whether that's a good practice. So I kind of like having a whole pepperoni so that you can not only can you eat it, but you can also put it on your cheeks as decoration. But
we all should end up a little more orange after eating pizza. That's just the truth.
Yeah.
Steve, I really want to thank you for coming on and giving us an hour of your time. We could probably have had 3 short stories in this time, but I want to thank you absolutely for coming on here and sharing with us. It means a lot. You've meant a lot to me. Not that you'd ever have known it if it were not for tonight, but you were a big time influence and someone who helped definitely tilt me over from just the normies over into those extreme fans of the horror genre. So you were out there fighting the good or bad fight, depending on how you look at it. And I just want to tell you that it's all been worth it, man. All of it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Any final words? Where can people follow you online?
My website is stevetem.com. And you'll find almost anything you want to know about me, including my complete bibliography, which you can download as a PDF. It has all the news about what I'm publishing and links to order things. I'd also like to say that my next short story collection is Trauma Stories. It'll be out from Valancourt Books, the same publisher who published my Figures Unseen selected stories. It'll be out sometime in June. In pretty much every format, a hardcover, paperback, limited, and audio, and ebook.
Awesome. But we're holding out for the Braille edition.
Oh, well, maybe you could hire someone to read it to you.
Probably have better success that anyway.
Yeah.
Steve, thanks so much. For everyone out there, the show will be back on Friday at 8 p.m. when Kevin Lucia will be the guest. And then on Monday, we're doing another Just Talking genre solo show. So hope to see you all then. Thanks. Have a great one.
Thank you.